Hello, guys. Good morning. It is 8:37. It is post-Christmas, and I want to wish again a belated birthday to a friend of mine who had a birthday yesterday, and let me see. Let me fix this here. Well, for breakfast, I'm having a waffle with peanut butter and banana slices. Yummy. And a cup of coffee. Now, I'm watching the redacted news. This guy here, Steve Baker, he was a journalist that got busted for, he got arrested for exposing the truth about January 6th. And he's a Blaze journalist, and it is a sad, very sad. Because you got the elites, you got the elites that are that will arrest you for even that, exposing, exposing the truth about an event, any event, and journalism has become a dangerous job for a lot of people who's in the business of media, truth telling, and exposing the wrongdoing of people. To me, it's more about telling the truth. I think telling the truth is the best thing, but there's there is a real crossroads that any journalist would have, because there's been journalists over the years that have completely left the networks, their newspapers, and went on their own. Went into syndication, did their own. They became syndicated columnists, journalists, freelance journalists, independent journalists, because they left because they some would say because of the money. Some would leave because of integrity and morality, because they get tired of the politics in the life of a journalist. They chose to walk away from the bullshit, the lies, the propaganda, the opinionated fact-checking bullshit, all that, But this guy here, he's on the Blaze. He's a Blaze journalist, Steve Baker, and he was arrested for exposing the truth of January 6th. Now, a few years ago, when Obama was still in office, he went after a Fox reporter. He went straight up like a shark seeing blood, seeing red, and had a Fox journalist arrested and charged him with the Espionage Act. Like, really? Like, it seems that it's the only weapon that a president has against anybody. We're going to charge this son of a bitch with the Espionage Act. Okay, so, you're going to charge a reporter who's doing their job. I mean, put aside the whole Fox thing, the whole CNN thing. It's the reporter, the journalist, him or herself, the journalist who's doing the job. Like, for example, Sean Hastings, the late Sean Hastings. He was an independent journalist that wrote articles. An independent investigative journalist that took down a military general. Took him down with a story. He investigated. He didn't just leave. He resigned in embarrassment. This general did. And he exposed Petraeus, General Petraeus. He was a general in the Air Force. Who's a former CIA director. And when he was investigating Petraeus, General Petraeus, who's now a civilian now, things got heavy. Things got heavy for Sean Hastings. So one night, he tweeted that he needs to go underground. It's getting heavy. He told his family and friends, "Hey, I gotta go underground. Things are getting heavy." And so that's what he did. He went underground, but before he did, he was found dead. He was killed, and he ended up, from what the LAPD said, he hit a tree, and that's how the engine and transmission shot out. Any accident investigator would say otherwise. If you went head on to a tree, the whole thing would be in your lap. Be in your lap. No. Witnesses said the car, poof, and what caused the engine and transmission to fire out like a cannonball out of a cannon. Just, phew. He was burned to death, and LAPD had him cremated without his family's knowledge. His wife's pissed that they have this car in impound. It will not allow anybody to see it. Why? So they could crush it and destroy evidence. So, here's Steve Baker.
Well, the Inspector General's report is out on January 6th, and it confirms what we knew all along. the FBI had dozens of informants in the crowd that day. It also confirms the FBI lied to the American people about what happened that day. Also, Democrats in Congress lying to the American people on what happened that day. Not surprising at all. Our next guest was targeted and arrested by Biden's FBI because he had the audacity to be a journalist on that day, an independent journalist on January 6th. That day, he was there with his camera.
I'm sorry, not Blaze reporter, journalist, but independent journalist. I'm sorry.
Microphone capturing what was happening as the day unfolded, hundreds of hours of footage as a result of it. But of course, that didn't comport with the official narrative of an insurrection on that day. Steve Baker is now an investigative journalist with The Blaze, and boy, does he have a story to tell. And I wanted to have Steve on to really talk about the Inspector General's report, but also give our audience a little bit of history here on what it was like to be a journalist there on that day, a day that really changed everything for him. Steve, welcome to the show. Nice to see you for the first time here on Redacted.
Hey, Clayton. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with that day. Just maybe you can kind of contextualize what happened for you on January 6th as an independent journalist going to the Capitol on that day.
Very simply, I had no clue what the day would unfold to be. I went there to cover the event at the Ellipse. I had my man-on-the-street microphone, the camera. I was going to interview some people, see what they thought. Actually, at that time, we were still wondering if they were going to, quote-unquote, release the Kraken. You remember that? About
right.
the controversial election. And so that's what I was there to see if that happened. Actually, of course, obviously, nothing like that took place on the stage from any of the speakers or President Trump himself. So myself and another writer, we started working our way over to the Capitol early because there were planned events there. There were actually licensed, permitted events at the Capitol that day, 6 of them permitted by the Capitol Police. And so knowing that these other events were taking place, I headed that direction. And I got there probably about roughly 25 minutes after the violence had already started. So I wasn't, even there when it first took place. And first thing I did is I turned on my camera and went into photojournalist mode, which I'm not. That's not what I do for a living. But the point being is that's what I ended up doing for the next couple of hours. And I followed the story where the story went. I captured the violence that was happening on the Lower West Terrace there, and then when the line broke through up top, and there was eventually a breach of the building itself, which I did not see. I was not there for that. But I lined up in a line of hundreds of people that were going in, including, Clayton, 80 to 100 other journalists, by the way, that we have identified who entered from the outside to the inside. These were not the journalists that were assigned covering the event, the certification on the inside. So there was between 80 and 100 other journalists that actually went in from the outside. And there was only about 4 or 5 of us that were charged. Now, as you can imagine, the 4 or 5 of us that were charged with crimes were ones that reported to the right side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, shocking, right?
Right.
I think it's unbelievable the number of journalists that were there that day that, of course, if they were with the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever else, they didn't have to live in sort of terror for a number of years. You then received a letter, an email, from the Department of Justice, basically letting you know that you were about to be charged, and then for 2 years you had to live under this umbrella of waiting, right, to find out if you were going to be charged. I actually first learned about your story. You were on my friend.
Even if he was like not even near the Capitol, I mean, he could be 1,000 yards away, but yet be in D.C. I mean, he could be 6 blocks away and still charge, Owen Schroyer, he wasn't even, he was at the Capitol, but he wasn't on the grounds. He was like on the outskirts of the ground. I mean, he was like 100 yards back on the outskirts, not right there, just on the outskirts. He still got arrested. He still looked at 3 years in prison, And there was a Proud Boy, a member of the Proud Boys, wasn't even in D.C. at the time, but yet he was somewhere else, not in D.C., but yet he was still arrested for the insurrection, alleged insurrection, allegedly. Wow! I mean, you have the founder of Oath Keepers, which is a group of former military, former law enforcement who took the oath personally and seriously. You know, former military, former law enforcement that took their oath seriously. You know, the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, saw the Oath Keepers as a dangerous organization, which technically they're not. They're not, you know. But
and Tucker Carlson's show before he left Fox News, that's how I first learned of your story. And I think that charge you had just learned about was sort of imminent at that time, wasn't it?
It was. I had been threatened with prosecution by the Department of Justice in November of 21. So this was a week before Thanksgiving of 2021. And then we went into a media blitz to kind of like a counteroffensive. And as a result of that, we didn't hear from them again for 20 months. So in August of last year, August of 23, I got a grand jury subpoena for my videos that I'd taken that day. So now we knew that they had either reopened the investigation or they were looking deeper into my situation. And then it was another 5-6 months before we got another notification from the FBI that, in fact, I was going to be charged. We went into another media offensive this time. We held them back for another 3 months. And then finally, at the end of February, they contacted my attorney and said he's got to turn himself in.
3 years later.
And so we voluntarily, cooperatively complied.
3 years later.
And I was self-presented to the FBI field office here in Dallas, Texas. And that's where they put me in chains and took me before a magistrate at the federal courthouse. For misdemeanor. By the way, leg chains for nonviolent misdemeanor crimes.
Misdemeanors in the United States, I've never heard of someone being arrested in that capacity for a misdemeanor and hauled before cameras like that. Have you?
No, as a matter of fact, 2 of my attorneys are former federal prosecutors, both of them with over 20 years in government service, both of them assistant U.S. attorneys at the time, and in their entire careers, they had never, ever seen that one time. And in the 100-plus year history of the FBI, they never so much as investigated a misdemeanor case until January 6th.
Well, it's good to know they're really doing the work of the American people right now, protecting us from people like you.
Exactly.
I mean, it's unbelievable. So thank you for that context there. Hope our audience understands, what has happened to our country, the weaponization of the Department of Justice. And, we had Christopher Wray and other members of the FBI testifying before Congress multiple times. And now we know lying to the American people, lying to Congress about informants, agents in the crowd that
just don't run for office or some oligarch might use the IRS on your ass.
A day, were they there to incite the crowd, get them to come into the Capitol? We know Nancy Pelosi on camera talking about this trap that she talked about publicly. We now know from video footage of that, along with Chuck Schumer. So your response to this Inspector General's report, which shows and confirms that there were informants in the crowd that day, using that term instead of FBI agents, what did you make of that when you saw this report?
Well, first of all, when you analyze the report, and you've done as much research into this for the last 4 years as I have, you realize that there was a lot left out. And then when you talk about who the actual CHSs were, the confidential human sources, as opposed to FBI agents, as opposed to undercover agents, there's a lot of misinformation. In fact, there's a lot of misinformation on both sides, our side, their side, that are misinterpreting this report. Let's start from the beginning, because it can be worse and it can be not as bad depending upon how you look at it. The first thing is we know that we had this number of a couple dozen CHSs. Now, these are confidential human sources. These are not employees of the FBI. These are basically contractors that are assigned to follow somebody, maybe even participate with them in the development of a crime to a certain place, but they're not supposed to break laws while they're doing that. We know that a number of them did, in fact, go inside the restricted space. We know that a number of them did go inside the building that day. And yet none of them were charged with crimes. And that actually has an interesting component to it, because they have a higher standard in that they know that they're not supposed to, participate and break any laws as a CHS. Now, again, they're not FBI agents. The one thing that this report does not cover, or let me back up. One thing that a lot of people are inappropriately commenting on and conflating this is they're calling these people undercover agents. No, they're not. An FBI undercover agent is a very specific assignment, a very specific protocol. It is a very specific duty, and you are trained to be an undercover agent. Now, there were probably, Clayton, I would estimate there were probably a couple of hundred FBI agents in that crowd that day. We're talking, well, the Hoover Building's just a few blocks down the road. The FBI Washington field office is there. And so because you are plain clothes, which most FBI special agents are anyway, it's not like the Hoover days when they all wore, black suit and tie and a white shirt. These guys dress casually. They wear jeans, they wear ducks, they wear button downs, they wear flannel shirts. And so these guys were in their offices that day, probably, I would assume, threw their winter, coats on and gloves and put a cap on and headed down to the crowd. And Clayton, that's not necessarily a nefarious thing. We would want our law enforcement agents to be in a position to observe and to a position to make sure that nothing bad happens in a crowd like that of that size, because that crowd ended up being much larger than anybody originally anticipated to begin with. And so having that many people observing and just doing the work of...
Now, how come Nancy Pelosi didn't get charged with that shit herself, since she orchestrated it and shit? I mean, it was proven that her and Chucky Schumer, those fuckers were involved in it themselves. How come that charge? Oh, that's right. They're protected. Yeah.
Making sure that everybody's safe is not a bad thing. All right. Now, if any of them donned MAGA gear, if any of those agents wore a MAGA cap or put on a Trump scarf or were carrying a Trump flag or something like that, now we enter the world of undercover FBI agent. That's a completely different designation. We have no proof that happened yet. We know beyond any shadow of a doubt that FBI agents there. We have identified them fake. We have other journalists, other investigative reporters who have actually done the work and have identified them, and we know that they were there. We don't know the number of them, and we probably never will. We certainly don't know the number of them from this IG report, but they do talk about the fact that they had no evidence of undercover agents working that crowd.
The report does go on to say that these were members of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. So they admit to that piece of it.
Well, look, I think there were probably more CHSs, confidential human sources, embedded in the Proud Boys than even this number reflects. There were certainly, we know because I covered the trials of the Oath Keepers, and we know that they had confidential human sources embedded in the Oath Keepers as well. Not so sure that the Oath Keepers had any there with them that day. It's likely they did, but they certainly were not on the same level as the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys famously, they like to knock heads. They were there to, they wanted to, what the Proud Boys wanted to do is they wanted to engage with Antifa and the like. They wanted to engage with, leftist provocateurs, and that didn't really happen, so they took out their adrenaline and their testosterone another way.
The Proud Boys are a group that was put together by Gavin McInnes to counter Antifa, and there are many Proud Boy chapters across the country. Okay, there are many chapters of the Proud Boys in the United States. How many? Do not exactly know. I don't exactly. I mean, don't exactly know how many chapters, but there are chapters across the board in the country that are counters to Antifa. What basically, if you think about it, it's a poor dumb white kid version of the Nazi Party. The brown shirts. Yeah, the brown shirts, and they wear all black, looking like rejects from auditioning for Beverly